Good morning. Today's presentation in honor of the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta is the result of an interdisciplinary collaboration among faculty in history, government, and English, and generous financial support provided by the North Foundation. I want to acknowledge in particular the work of Professor Stephen Medvick in getting things started when planning began last year, and Professor Dean Hammer for hosting a reception following today's presentation in New College House. You are all invited, by the way, to that reception if you don't have other obligations, and would be very pleased to have you. I'm going to keep this introduction short to allow maximum time for our speaker, but just a very, very quick orientation. The Middle Ages. We begin in the Middle Ages, 1,000 years long, ending about 1500. Those are the only dates that I'm going to give you. Recently, the Middle Ages have actually been very present in the news, in the media, if you've paid attention, and some of my colleagues are fond of sending me news about the Middle Ages in the news, and maybe you saw some of these headlines, and I'm quoting actual headlines here. I've got three of them. So first, astonishing, Anglo-Saxon remedy kills superbug MRSA. That was just from last month. Going back the month before that, rats exonerated in spread of Black Death. I still have my doubts about the rats. And my third and final, amazing, with an exclamation point, amazing, original Magna Carta copy found in scrapbook. And that brings us to this morning's speaker. The co-discoverer of that long-concealed copy is our speaker, Professor Nicholas Vincent of the University of East Anglia. Professor Vincent is an expert in Anglo-French political history with a particular interest in charters, kinship, and relics. He has published a dozen books and many articles, including much praised explorations of the reign of King Henry III. Also, Magna Carta, a very short introduction, which I believe is available for sale at the back of the auditorium this morning. And he also wrote the Sotheby's catalog for the auction of a 1297 copy of the Charter. That 1297 copy, by the way, is now in the National Archives in Washington. And if you want to look on their website, Sotheby's will be very happy to tell you how much it sold for. At present, he leads a major research project on the history of Magna Carta involving nearly a dozen scholars and supported by government grants in the UK. So if there is anyone more knowledgeable about Magna Carta, I don't know who it would be, and I'm pleased to introduce to you Professor Nicholas Vincent.
Hello. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I seem to have some feedback there, but I'm going to stand away from the microphone like that, and hopefully that'll be a bit better. And I'm going to give you about 45-50 minutes on Magna Carta. Now, you possibly don't know who this gentleman is, but he will be the King of England in due course. And 2 weeks ago, he opened a large exhibition in London on Magna Carta, law, liberty, and legacy. And that was an exhibition that I and others helped organize, and it brings together the history of this document over the last 800 years. This is one of my colleagues, Claire Bray, showing the Prince of Wales the tomb effigy of King John, the king who granted Magna Carta, at Worcester Cathedral. Look very carefully at the future King Charles's cheek. He's got his tongue very firmly in his cheek, not because, unlike you, he's not eating pizza, but because he is looking at the teeth of King John, which are displayed as part of our exhibition. King John's teeth, which were excavated in his tomb in the 1790s. And not just King John's teeth are displayed in our exhibition, but that rather nasty piece of what looks like a chicken bone is actually King John's thumb. And one must imagine that when King John came to sign Magna Carta, he pressed down on the parchment with that very thumb that Prince Charles is looking at. Now, I don't need to tell you, of course, that that is a load of nonsense, because we all know, it's one of the few things that everybody knows in history, that King John did not actually sign Magna Carta. This is a fact that hasn't as yet been explained to the Royal Mint, the official makers of English coinage, who produced a £2 coin earlier this year, showing King John with a charter in one hand and a pen in the other. You in America get these things right. These are the great bronze doors of the Supreme Court building in Washington, and there you can see King John with Magna Carta in one hand, and in the other he's got a thing, a bit like those date stamps they stick in your passport when you come through emigration. He's got what in the Middle Ages was the preferred use of seals, a seal press. That should serve as a reminder that even in America, Magna Carta is an iconic document. It has been totemized. One can say it's come close to being worshipped in America over the last 250 years. Representations of the granting of Magna Carta are to be found far and wide across this continent, not only on the brass doors of the Supreme Court, but here on the frieze inside the Supreme Court building in Washington. Here in the state capitol at Madison, Wisconsin, in 1915, you get the model from which that seal press idea, the date stamp idea of the seal, was derived. Here in Cleveland, Ohio, in 1913, we have a socialist presentation of Magna Carta, no longer as a bunch of barons and bishops hanging around, but as the common people of England, the peasantry, the ordinary people, celebrating the grant of their liberties. In Indiana, they do things rather differently even today. And in 1935, despite the fact that there had been 20 years of seal presses shown on American images of Magna Carta, here we have King John signing Magna Carta in the old-fashioned way. It's the good old way. Here in the National Cathedral of New York, donated in 1907, we have a rather peculiar demonstration of Magna Carta. I don't think it's being signed or sealed. It's being handed over rather like a bag of toffees to King John. And you can see the barons in the background looking and wondering to themselves, is that a strawberry-flavoured one or not? As recently as 1959, when the Los Angeles Supreme Court building was constructed, they chose to put on the front of that building an iconic image of a baron holding Magna Carta. In other words, Magna Carta is hardwired into the American legal and political system, just as it is into the systems of England and Europe. 17 of the United States have incorporated the text of Magna Carta within their state constitutions, beginning with South Carolina in the 1830s, most recently with North Dakota in the 1940s. In England, by contrast, the vast majority of the clauses of Magna Carta, all but 3.5 of them, have been repealed over the last 150 years. And the consequence there is that you have far more feudal law, far more of the medieval law of England enforced in America than is the case across the Atlantic in England. That should remind us also that as a physical artifact, Magna Carta has played a role in American history. This is the opening of the recent exhibition in the Library of Congress, opened by a junior member of the royal family. We had the senior member, her brother. This is Princess Anne. And there was displayed the Lincoln Magna Carta, one of 4 original Magna Cartas from 1215 that still survive in Lincoln Cathedral Library. But that Lincoln Cathedral Charter has very frequently crossed to America. It came first in 1939, and here it is being handed over in 1939 by the then British ambassador for keeping in the Library of Congress. It came to New York in 1939 as part of a propaganda drive to stir up enthusiasm in America for American intervention against the Germans in World War II. And it was displayed in the British Pavilion of the 1939 New York World's Fair, and here you see it being visited by the then King, George VI, the grandfather of Charles, the man who opened our exhibition. In that exhibition in New York in 1939, Magna Carta was presented as it were, the old world versus the new. This, you will be glad to know, though not yet in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, is the Road of Tomorrow, which was one of the exhibits in the World's Fair. This, looking even less like Lancaster, Pennsylvania, is Futurama, the model city of 1960. Though I was in Baltimore yesterday, and I can testify that that is indeed what has happened to a lot of America. The most popular exhibit in that exhibition was not Magna Carta, but the Westinghouse Hall of Electrical Living, where Electro, the Westinghouse motor man, went through 26 mechanical movements. He could walk, he could talk, and please remember this is 1939, so no suits, please. He could also smoke a cigarette. He would now, of course, go to jail. Even so, as a result of Magna Carta's display in 1939 and 1940, over 15 million Americans came to view this document. And that connection with Magna Carta stretched all the way through to the bicentennial of 1976, where the British government, I think rather cruelly, gave the Library of Congress this quite monstrous combination of gold leaf, jewellery, enamel, and a rare 3 billion-year-old volcanic stone from the Outer Hebrides as a symbol, it's a facsimile of Magna Carta, a copy of Magna Carta, of the ongoing connections between England and America. And that, in a sense, was sealed in 2007 when David Rubenstein purchased at Sotheby's in New York the only copy of Magna Carta that survives in North America, that originally belonged to the presidential candidate Ross Perot, was deposited in the National Archives, and then sold in 2007 for $21.3 million. Why then pay $21.3 million for something that looks not particularly beautiful? Here we need to go back to the reign of King John, the king who actually brought this document into being. King John has gone down in history as the worst of England's kings. Foul as is hell, hell itself is defiled by the presence of King John, so one of his contemporary chroniclers tells us. What was so foul about King John? King John's greatest crime was that he was a failure. He failed in two important respects. Medieval kings did two things above all else. They defended their lands and they did justice. King John lost a lot of land. Just as a king who won battles, like William the Conqueror, who in 1066 defeated the Saxons and established a new Norman dynasty on the throne of England, just as he declared that God was on his side, so King John's loss of those continental lands in 1204 condemned him as a failure. Before that, and you can see it there coloured pink, because this was, in the eyes of those 19th century map makers, the first British Empire. We had one back in the Middle Ages. Then we had another one. We won't talk about that one. That came to an end sometime around 1776. And then we went and got a proper one in the 19th century. But on all the good maps, it's coloured pink. That's the colour of the British flag. And here you have the medieval English Empire in France. John lost all those territories south of the English Channel in 1204. Before that, English government depended on charters for its success. The king was often in Scotland. How could he communicate with France? He was in France. How could he communicate with England? He did so using these things that we call charters. They're just letters. They're written on animal skin, on the skin of sheep. Magna Carta must be the only constitutional document in the history of the world whose extent is limited by the size of how much writing you can get on a medieval sheep. They use these documents both to give out instructions and laws, but also to display their might and majesty. Look at the seal on one side of that document. You've got the king seated in power on his throne. And on the other side, we have, as it were, hard power, the king riding into battle on a big horse, wielding a sword. Now, I was in your archive earlier on today, and I was able to cut off a seal. I'll pass it round. This gentleman will come. I don't want to kill you. There we go. Yes, he's got it. Do pass it round. If you look on one side, you've got the king seated in majesty, and on the other side, the king seated on a horse. I don't entirely joke here. With Ben McCree, about half an hour ago, I went into the Lancaster, Franklin and Marshall archive And there you have a charter, a medieval charter. Here it is. It's the first time it's been photographed and displayed to an audience like this. It's in your archive, and this is issued by the then Earl of Hereford, a man named Henry de Bohun. And if you look at the bottom of this document, there is the seal of this baron. And do you know, this man was at Runnymede in 1215, was one of the Magna Carta barons. And until 10 minutes ago, or half an hour ago, or whenever it was we took these photographs, nobody knew that that relic of Runnymede was actually in your archive. So I found that really rather a moving moment. John lost all that land, though, and his barons revolted against him, and they used their swords and their horses to raise an army against the king. They did so not just because John was a failure in battle, but because he was also a very bad piece of work. And here you see, as it were, the worst of his actions. You can tell it's terrible because there is a bat flying around in the darkness behind him. He murdered his own nephew. His young nephew, Arthur of Brittany, rebelled against him, claiming that he, rather than John, had the right to the throne. John captured Arthur at Mirabeau on the Loire. He locked him away. Now, that was standard stuff. This was a very dysfunctional family. This was a really bad family, the Plantagenet kings of England. They'd often blinded, castrated, got rid of, locked away members of their own family. But they hadn't killed. They didn't kill their cousins or their brothers. John killed his nephew. Arthur was never seen again. No one knows quite what happened to him. It was the death of Arthur, the very clear evidence that the king was unjust and would not do justice, that led to the rebellion in John's French lands and in due course chased him out of France. For the next 10 years, John devoted his time to assembling a vast war treasure in order to reconquer the lands that he'd lost. And to do that, he used the resources of his writing office and he used the exchequer. Now again, you don't have this, but I brought this with me, and I was worried I would be stopped in the airport coming into Washington at Dulles for trafficking in antiquities. But I've got an exchequer record here which I'll pass around. Do not confuse them for your lunch. You'll see they have holes in them. That's because rats and mice sometimes confuse them for lunch. Do not try and eat them. These are 15th century charters. They're not actually 13th century. They're not the same date as the charter. They're a little bit younger. They're written in French. It's due by all means passing around. And at the end, they have the back. They're not very valuable, but they're still of sentimental interest to me. John used all of that writing, the technology of writing, the technology of counting, to assemble money. And in doing so, he produced a vast tide of parchment record keeping. We know an awful lot about what happened in King John's reign because we have thousands of letters for each year of that reign. This is just one of 4 rolls covering the year 1216. There are 4 vast parchment rolls, all plastered with individual letters. And if we get up a little bit close and personal with 1 or 2 of those letters, we also learn from them quite a lot about the personality of King John. You can see in the left-hand margin that the scribe who's been copying out this letter got bored, as probably many of you are today getting bored and beginning to doodle on your pizza. What the scribe has drawn here is a picture of the bird that we know as the crane, and under it is an inscription that says, "The Mad Crane," and then a name, Philippa de Poten. Now, she was a woman whose husband had rebelled against the king, and she had clearly come to court seeking justice. And the justice that she received was to have her cartoon scrawled in the margins of the king's rolls. That tells us something about the cruelty of King John's court. Imagine today going to the Supreme Court in Washington and having one of the Supreme Court justices draw a rude cartoon of you. There would be no end of it. That would be the end of his career, or possibly not. This record, which you won't be able to read because it's written in Latin, as were all of the records of King John's reign. The king spoke French but used Latin in his documents. This is a famous account whereby the wife of the king's chief forester offered the king 200 chickens so that she may lie one night with her husband. Now, the use of chickens to purchase sex is a fairly fringe pursuit even in Europe, even today. But what was going on here is anyone's guess. Quite possibly it's a joke. She's saying not that she's the king's mistress and she wants to buy her way out of his bed, but that her husband is never there, she wants him around, and therefore she will give the king some chickens. But it does show us the way in which even the records of official government business are transformed into a clubland betting book in those dark winter evenings. This is an instance which is familiar to me and to some of you who lose your passwords. Here, the king has laid down passwords for those who wanted to visit Arthur and the other prisoners in the king's prison in France. He'd laid down a password, but he'd forgotten it, and he's doing exactly what we do on the phone when they say, "Can we have your telephone password, please, your telephone banking word?" And you say, "I'm terribly sorry, I just don't remember what it is. I know I had one, but I just can't remember it. And anyway, I am who I say I am." And that's what the king is saying in this letter. "I may have laid down a password, but I don't remember what it is. And anyway, I am the king." Now, all of that suggests a government of cruelty, a government of personalities that were widely mistrusted. John was a man who would stab you in the back. He was not a man to trust. He also came from a dysfunctional family that was notorious throughout the Christian world for an event that had taken place 30 years before John came to the throne. In 1170, John's father had encompassed the murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, and ever afterwards the Plantagenet family had been regarded as the spawn of the devil. As a result, in 1205, when King John tried to get his own candidate appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, the Pope refused. This is the Pope, Innocent III, who in effect insisted that the church now go on strike against the king. For 8 long years, the Mass, the sacraments were not celebrated. The king himself was excommunicated. From John's point of view, that had advantages. He was able to up the size of his war chest by now seizing the lands of large numbers of churchmen, to add to all of those exactions and taxes that he was charging against his barons. In 1214, he used that money to pay for a vast army of reconquest in France. He travelled to the south of France, another army of his travelled to Flanders, to the region north of Paris. And there, on the 27th of July, 1214, that northern English army was entirely wiped out in a battle, the Battle of Bouvines, that is as important in French history as the Battle of Hastings is in the history of England. For the second time in his reign, the king was forced to slink back to England, defeated in war. And the consequence there was inevitable. Having paid the king high taxes, the barons then revolted against him. And in May 1215, they seized the city of London, the king's chief treasure chamber, the king's capital. With the seizure of London, the king was forced into negotiation. You can see in the distance there, Windsor Castle, and in the front of that picture, you can see the River Thames. Well, the king came out of Windsor to meet the barons coming from London. And the place where they met, Runnymede, is a sort of halfway neutral, liminal place. Look at that picture. That's what it looked like in the 18th century. That's what it looks like today with the large Slough power station built slap bang in the middle of that view. You can see there how well we look after our heritage back in the old country. We know an awful lot about what happened at Runnymede because even those who were there gathered together relics of what had happened. That's some indication of how important they knew these events to be even at the time. So we have a draft called the Articles of the Barons that leads on to this document, Magna Carta itself. Now, what is so important about Magna Carta? You all know, I'm sure, that Magna Carta gives you the following things. It gives you habeas corpus, freedom from arrest. It gives you Parliament, or your House of Representatives. It gives you democracy. In fact, it doesn't do any of those things at all. It's supposedly granted to you and me, but it isn't really. Look at who it's really granted to. We have, first of all, granted to God. And by this, our present charter confirmed that the liberties of the church shall be intact. In other words, this is granted, first of all, to the English church and to God. You grant it to God because once you've given God things, you can't say, "God, I gave you 4 pence last week. Could I have it back, please?" a bit like your constitution, which is set on a high, glittering hill far above political debate. So by granting Magna Carta to God, Magna Carta was put in a special category. You'll be delighted to know, though, those of you who do business studies and who are off to make a lot of money on Wall Street, that Magna Carta does guarantee the liberties of that great city oligarchy, the City of London, bankers' bonuses, the right to freedom from arrest for the normal offences that white-collar criminals would receive. All of that is hardwired into the text of Magna Carta. And that clause on the church and that clause on the City of London are two of the only 3.5 clauses of Magna Carta that survive on the statute book in England today. Clause 14 is very important. Clause 14 of the 1215 Magna Carta effectively says there should be no taxation without representation. That if the king charges taxes, then a council should meet to debate those taxes. This is the origins of what we call Parliament. And that clause, Clause 14 of Magna Carta, was law in England for at least 12 weeks. Like the rest of Magna Carta, it died ignominiously at the beginning of September 1215. And it was never heard of again. That's just a step too far as the kings of England are concerned. What did survive and what is of great significance are these 1.5 clauses. And if there is any iconic statement in Magna Carta, it is here. No free man will be taken or imprisoned or have his property taken away, or outlawed, or exiled, or in any way ruined, nor shall we go or send against him save by the lawful judgment of his peers and by the law of the land. To no one shall we sell, to no one shall we deny or delay right or justice. Now that is fundamentally significant in the history of constitution making across the world. It's the origins of what we would call due process. It's the origins of that idea that the state and the sovereign are themselves placed under the rule of law. And it is also immensely vague. It says that the king should henceforth only act by lawful judgment of the peers of whoever is being accused and by the law of the land. But what is the law of the land? And who are your peers? If you are a rich man, are your peers, your pairs, same word in French gives us a pair of cards, are they your equals, are they other rich men, or can you be judged by poor men? If you're a poor man, should you be judged by the rich? And what is the law of the land? No one at this time had written it down. If the king said on Thursday that the law of the land said the law makes everybody give their money to the king, then that was the law. That due process clause that develops from this, that is incorporated into the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and into a large number of other constitutional settlements, has been signed up to by governments across the world. North Korea believes in due process. Pol Pot probably believed in due process. It all depends on what the process is. In other words, where we might expect Magna Carta to be most specific, it is often most vague. And where we might like it to be most vague, it is often most specific. Many of you are haunted by terror that fish weirs will be built on the rivers Medway and Thames. You may rest assured that this clause of Magna Carta remained law in England through to 1970. It's a law designed to protect the navigation of the City of London. It has nothing really to do with the rights of common people. It does have a general principle, the principle of free navigation, which did play a part in the history of North America, though not one necessarily that the British care to remember. It's the right of free navigation that lay behind the 7 Years' War, that the British then tried to persuade the American colonists to pay for, which the American colonists were not very happy about, which led on to other things. And in one way or another, you can trace that back to Magna Carta Clause 33. But this is a very specific clause designed to benefit a particular group of individuals. Clause 50 of Magna Carta might appeal to the NRA and to various people, as it were, on one or other extremes of American politics even today. It basically leads to the expulsion from England of all foreigners, or at least all foreign knights who have come to the realm with arms and horses to the detriment of the kingdom. Kick out the foreigners. That is not a clause of Magna Carta, though, that those who talk about law and liberty and freedom care to remember. And that clause, too, died almost immediately in the summer of 1215. The long list of people who are individually to be expelled probably doesn't mean much to you. Engelard de Sigogny, Geoffrey de Martigny, these are not names that have echoed down the ages. But you will know one of them. He's a man named Philip Mark. Here he is in the Disney representation of the Sheriff of Nottingham, which is what he was. And here he is in the Alan Rickman, before Alan Rickman became Professor Snape. And here Alan Rickman is saying, I'm going to cut out your heart with a spoon, which is what most of us remember about the Middle Ages. He's getting truly medieval on people. Well, the Sheriff of Nottingham, Philip Mark, was one of the King's chief supporters, and the intention of those clauses is to keep the King's military might to a minimum, to prevent the King from using his army against the rebel barons, against the City of London. All of that resulted in a civil war in which Magna Carta was effectively buried, forgotten, in which the Pope annulled the Charter, in which the King repudiated it, the barons went to war against him, and King John died a year later in the middle of this civil war. There is his tomb at Worcester Cathedral. Now, the outcome of John's death was to leave a 9-year-old boy, John's son, Henry III, on the throne of England. And the councillors of that young boy, in order to buy support, now revived Magna Carta and transformed it from a settlement imposed upon the king into one in which the king voluntarily agreed to a manifesto of future good government if he would be recognised in due course as rightful king of England. As a result, Magna Carta was reissued in 1216, in 1217, this is the 1217 reissue, and on both occasions the Pope's legate, the Pope's personal representative in England, put his seal to it, so that the Church now supported the Charter. The effect here was to reintroduce a large part of Magna Carta into English law. Out went all the obnoxious clauses, all that stuff about foreigners, out that went. Out went all that stuff about having to have a council to decide on matters above the king. That all disappeared. But the underlying legal principles were revived. They were reissued in 1216, 1217, again in 1225, again in 1297, and at last in 1300. And it's because of all those reissues across the 13th century that we today have 24 original Magna Cartas. There's one in Washington, there's one in Canberra, the other 22 are in English archives. The Canberra Magna Carta and the Washington Magna Carta that David Rubenstein bought in 2007 both come from that issue of 1297. Now, even as early as 1300, 1297, Magna Carta was beginning to get creaky. It was beginning to look archaic. It dealt with all sorts of issues of feudal law that had mattered in 1215, but that didn't matter much anymore. Again, it owed its survival and its revival to its use in a different context in the 17th century, when the Stuart kings of England began to demand taxes without representation. And their then Chief Justice, Edward Coke, used Magna Carta in his Institutes of the Laws of England to argue that there was an underlying ancient constitution that no king could contravene, save at his peril. As a result, Magna Carta was used in the 17th century, 400 years after its original issue, in the wars against Charles I and ultimately in deposing King Charles. In the meantime, it crossed to America as the genetic birthright of all who had been born in England. So all of those settlers who came to the United States from across the Atlantic carried with them the rights of free-born English citizens. And in America, they received charters, like the charter granted to the colony of Virginia, which included the right to all of the laws that would have applied to them had they lived in the home country. As a result, the common law of England is said to have crossed the Atlantic to Jamestown with the granting of that Jamestown Charter to the state of Virginia. And in the 18th century, when taxation was attempted against the American colonies without their consent, people like John Wilkes used Magna Carta, you can see him holding it in his hand here, to argue that the American colonists were entitled to the liberties, the freedom from arrest, the freedom from the billeting of troops that Magna Carta seemed to convey. As a result, the idea of due process under the law entered the Bill of Rights, the idea of no taxation without representation entered the Declaration of Independence, and we end up in that situation where 17 of the United States incorporate the entire text of Magna Carta within their state constitutions. But there are problems with the use of Magna Carta in America. The first of them takes us back to the bishops. There are bishops in Magna Carta, and there is something called the English Church, which looks a little bit like the Anglican Church, for which read the Episcopalian Church. America in the 18th century, indeed at the beginning of the 19th century, was not a land given to Episcopalian authority. And as a result, the building in of that clause gave rise to fears that Magna Carta had quite a lot to do with the Catholic Church, or indeed with the Anglican establishment from which many American settlers were fleeing. America was a land of liberty, but in the southern states, lawyers in the southern states and in Jamaica used Clause 20 of Magna Carta, which divided free men from villains, free men from peasants, to argue that Magna Carta itself supported the institution of slavery. Villains had one fate under the law, freemen another. And remember here too that in the 19th century, relations between England and America were not as friendly as they became in the era of Tony Blair and George Bush, thank God. The Alabama incident, where the government of Mr. Gladstone, the great liberal, freedom-loving politician of England in the 19th century, supported the southern states against the Union, supported what was seen as it were, an aristocratic, English-looking society against something democratic and a bit scary, that led to all sorts of problems in Anglo-American relations. The Alabama actually took 65 prizes valued at $6 million. That didn't prevent Senator Charles Sumner, chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, from demanding $250 million in reparation or Canada. Having a brother-in-law in Ottawa, I can tell you precisely which one of those choices I would have made. As a result, a large number of those ventures in Anglo-American relations that use Magna Carta in the 20th century, for example, as early as 1918, Winston Churchill stating that the Declaration of Independence was only the third title deed of democracy, with Magna Carta as the first. A large number of those Anglo-American friendship networks were actually constituted on the basis of a very bad friendship. In many ways, America has been the giver rather than the receiver when it comes to Magna Carta. Take the site of Runnymede itself. This was rescued for the people of England by Cara Broughton, Lady Fairhaven. Her fortune came in part from the Rockefeller Standard Oil Company, in which her father became a director, having begun as a paraffin salesman, and partly from her husband, an Englishman, who introduced modern sanitation and sewage to the town of Fairhaven in Massachusetts. But it was Lady Broughton, or Lady Fairhaven, who in 1929 bought the site of Runnymede and gave it to the English people. Runnymede is now plastered with memorials to Anglo-American cooperation, this great Air Force memorial. The rotunda paid for by the American Bar Association, though I don't think they paid for the dog, which looks as if it's going to go and visit the rotunda. The perhaps less than entirely beautiful JFK Kennedy Memorial, which the Queen unveiled there in 1965 on the 750th anniversary of Magna Carta. I've said in another context that the collection of monuments at Runnymede would not disgrace a provincial crematorium, and I think that's about right. The latest idea, and these three gentlemen have proposed it, is that a 14-foot high statue of Her Majesty the Queen, cast in bronze, be placed there as a commemoration for this summer. And if that happens, really, we should just give up and give Runnymede entirely to America. Because what we're talking about there is something that looks a bit like that. It's really not a very beautiful thing. It's going to cost £350,000. Now, when the Magna Carta was sold in New York in 2007, I wrote the catalogue, and that led me to discover all sorts of things about Magna Carta that weren't previously known, and I'm going to give you a few of those at the end of this talk. So we're coming into the end days now. It became apparent to me that because Magna Carta is so well known, so iconic, so totemic, there's an awful lot about it that no one had bothered to look for. For example, in 2007, I unearthed the extraordinary story of Winston Churchill's attempt to give the Lincoln Magna Carta, then on display in the New York World's Fair, to the American people, as a means of bringing America into the war on the side of England against the Nazis. There's a whole file of correspondence in the Public Record Office in London in which Churchill says, "Bring this before Cabinet. It is a very good idea." It foundered largely because Magna Carta, at least in part, is a defense of private property, and Winston Churchill didn't own Magna Carta. It belonged to this bunch of gentlemen, a very scary-looking bunch of gentlemen they are too. This is the Dean and Chapter of Lincoln Cathedral. And when they found out that the Prime Minister was trying to give away their property, they were not very happy about it. Here they are receiving it back, rather like Dr. Quatermass, I think, and some strange thing from outer space. In 2007, I was also able to unearth the rather sad story of what happened when the Lincoln Charter returned to Lincoln. It was sent up to London to be conserved, and we have an extraordinarily mendacious letter from the then head of conservation at the Public Record Office in London, explaining how, due to a fungoid affection which might have developed in the long period of glass, during which it was, as I understand, immured between sheets of glass in Fort Knox, had been damaged. The text had almost faded away. The reality there, I'm afraid, is that when this document was sent up to London to be conserved, it was conserved by damping a sponge and then rubbing the sponge across the front of the document. And clearly taking a telephone call or eating a pie, the man who was doing pressed too hard on the document and destroyed quite a lot of the writing. It was part of that sale in 2007 that led to the discovery that there was actually a bomb attempt at the New York World's Fair where 2 policemen were killed by a bomb that blew up in the British pavilion, presumably planted not by Americans but by the Germans, though one never knows. That same sale led me to the extraordinary story of Miss Talbot. Now, in 1945, she gave the nation, on the right there, she gave them her copy, the 1225 Magna Carta, that had been held in her family's possession since the Reformation of the 16th century. And when the Lincoln Magna Carta returned to England, the British government decided that they wanted to continue this connection to America, so they sent Miss Talbot, fortunately not as she is there dressed in medieval costume, but Miss Talbot and her charter off to America as part of a propaganda drive. And I unearthed the correspondence file in which they explained that Miss Talbot, whilst in America, was to have an allowance of $8 a day, or $12 a day if she was staying in a hotel. Now, I don't know what sort of hotel you got for $4 a day back in 1945, but I suspect it wasn't very nice. It was that same sale in 2007 that led to the unearthing of the story of the bicentennial, where the British government spent £1 million on that horrible thing that they had the stupidity to call a casket, until it was explained to them what a casket is in America. This casket, they then called it a relic. That didn't go down very well. They spent £1 million on this thing. And there's a wonderful correspondence file there about the RAF, the military air force, who had to go off to the Isle of South Uist to pluck this 3-billion-year-old volcanic stone from the Outer Hebrides at enormous expense. We also find in 1976 the then Prime Minister saying, if they can't give Magna Carta to the American people, well, the Queen must have one. Somewhere up in Windsor Castle, he said, she's got lots of old stuff and she doesn't know what it is. Now, all of that led me to suppose that there was a lot more information out there than had been gathered. And so we put together a few years ago, 3 years ago, a major international project to investigate the background of Magna Carta towards this 800th anniversary year. And I'm going to take you through a very few of the new discoveries that this project has made. You can go on its website, you just go Magna Carta Research, and it will take you there immediately. A few weeks ago, we brought together the 4 surviving originals of Magna Carta 1215. 1 at Lincoln, 1 at Salisbury, 2 in the British Library. Now that was, at least in part, a propaganda exercise. It made for very good headlines in the British national newspapers, but it also led to some interesting discoveries. It allowed us to prove that one of those charters that's previously supposed to have come from somewhere else altogether actually came from Canterbury Cathedral, the burnt one in the British Library. It also led to questions about the origins of the other British Library Magna Carta original. And it allowed us to look at the back of that document, which in due course, someone's going to find that sort of writing on the back of a document somewhere else, who knows, maybe even in Franklin and Marshall. And when they do so, they will be able to pin down precisely what archive that document came from. In the meantime, normally that document is displayed under very, very subdued lighting. But we were able to look at it properly under spectrographic analysis. And what that showed is that there is writing all over the face of the document. Writing in a hand of about the 1390s, which means that at some point in the late 14th century, someone sufficiently important was able to get hold of an original Magna Carta and mark up the front of it. Why did they do that? Because in the 1390s, as I discovered just after Christmas in a manuscript in Gloucester Cathedral, in the 1390s, when the barons once again rebelled against their king, Richard II in this instance, they began to look back to precedents in the past, and they looked in particular to the committee of barons that was established by Magna Carta to sit in judgment on the king. So that in the 1390s, they were indeed using Magna Carta 1215 to argue for future restraint on royal law. About a year ago, in the Archbishop of Canterbury's archive at Lambeth Palace on the Thames, just over the road from the Houses of Parliament, I found this thing. Now, this won't mean much to you. It's a letter written in Latin. But what it is actually is the publication schedule for Magna Carta. It tells us how the document was actually to be published in the county court, and it even names the names of those knights who published the charter in the county of Kent. It's a document that's long been assumed to have existed, but until now had not been found. In December, late at night in a hotel in Belfast, having spoken at this thing, the Belfast Festival of Human Rights, I went on the internet, as many of you do when you stay in hotels. Now, I'm a bit of a nerd, so I went looking for Magna Cartas, whereas you go looking for other things altogether. But I found a reference in the Kent archives in Maidstone online to something called the Forest Charter, a junior Magna Carta. So I phoned up my friend, who is the archivist in Maidstone, and said, could you look in the box and see what's there? And he looked in the box, and the following day he came back to me and said, it's quite true, there is a Forest Charter there. There's also the 1300 Magna Carta from the town of Sandwich. And at that stage I choked on my cornflakes and my eyes bulged because I realized that this is the first original Magna Carta to have been discovered in England since the 1930s. It's a document of quite hideous external appearance. You can see it's been eaten by rats and mice, but of very considerable value. And it went around the world as a news story. This is the front page of Time. At the same time we brought together those 4 original 1215 Magna Cartas, I was able to bring together 230 charters of King John. I was hoping today that we might find one here, but we didn't, though, as I say, we did find one of the barons who was at Runnymede, which is no bad thing for Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And I think you should actually get that out in your newspapers. I think it's a very interesting story, and you can make quite a lot of that. Even so, we brought together the other charters that were issued by King John, not Magna Carta, but all the general letters of instruction and administration. Now, they survive all over the place. You'll see the name Lancaster on that list, but it's not your Lancaster, sadly. That's Lancaster in Lancashire in England. But all told, we've got over 220 of these originals. And if we compare them side by side, they're all written in hand by clerks of the court of King John, we can begin to find patterns. So that this charter for the men of Nottingham in 1200 was written by the same scribe who wrote that charter for another town in 1200. Look at the 2 hands, they are the same. Look at those 3 charters, and in fact there are about 20 of them, all written by this scribe. He was clearly one of the leading officials of the king's court who wrote out a lot of the king's business. And with that will help us, as it has done in this particular instance, to identify even a scrap like that. That's what's left after rats and mice have really pigged out on a piece of parchment, just a little fragment at the bottom. But it enables us to identify what that charter is, what date it is, who wrote it. It also raises a much more interesting question. Who wrote Magna Carta? This is the Lincoln Magna Carta. Here's the opening of it at the top. Here's the dating clause. Here's a charter issued by King John to Lincoln in July 1215. And there I'm showing you the top of that charter issued by the king to Lincoln a month after Magna Carta, and the Lincoln Magna Carta above it. And I hope you can see they're written in the same hand. And here's the bottom, and even if you look at that last word, it's the year of the king's reign, septimo decimo, the 17th year of the king's reign. They are in an identical script. In other words, the scribe who wrote the Lincoln Magna Carta also wrote other charters for the bishops of Lincoln. He wasn't a royal scribe at all. Here's the Salisbury Magna Carta, and here's a document I found in the Chippenham, Wiltshire Record Office a couple of years ago. This is issued by the Bishop of Salisbury, this is issued by the king, but they are written in a script that, if not precisely identical, is extraordinarily similar. In other words, what we have here is proof that Magna Carta, when it appeared looking not like a royal charter at all, but like an episcopal charter. And that if you looked at it, if you'd been one of those people in 1215 who'd first cast their eyes on Magna Carta, what you would have seen would have been an ecclesiastical document. And that should remind us that even today there are parts of the world, some of them not very far from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where religious law and religious tradition intrudes upon the civil law in a way that many of us, freedom-loving liberals living in the West, find uncomfortable. In other words, when you read Magna Carta in 1215, what you heard might have sounded rather like a national news broadcast with a plain chant introduction. And for all of that, apart from urging you to go and visit this project website, Magna Carta Research, where we've got all sorts of things like King John's diary, which isn't real because I know, because I'm writing it. We've got a whole lot of other things on there. Apart from visiting that, I would leave you with one thought. Often the things that we think we know best, we know very, very badly. Because it has been assumed that they have been done to death, they have not been done at all. And as in that wonderful Edgar Allan Poe story, The Purloined Letter, if you want to hide something, the best place is to hide it in plain view. And on that note, I thank you very much. Thank you. Now, I don't know how this works. I think there are questions. I know that lots of you have got to go. I don't feel any shame about leaving so early. But I do understand, absolutely. And you've all had your lunch, and I haven't, so the questions won't go on for very long.
My name is Morgan. I'm a junior. I'm a history major. I'm from Wisconsin, so that made me very happy that you have some incidences of this stuff happening in Wisconsin. Very exciting. I have several questions, but in the interest of time, I'll just ask one. You mentioned at the beginning that the Magna Carta is incorporated more into American law than into British law. Can you give us an idea of why that is?
Because you want to connect back to a much more ancient past. And if the book of Leviticus could be recited in the state's constitutions, I'm sure it would be in many instances. But it's a connection back to a much more ancient past. It leads to problems. New Hampshire Republicans recently insisted that all new legislation passing through the House of Representatives in New Hampshire, if it changed the Constitution, must refer to an original clause of Magna Carta. I'm not quite sure which clause that might be. Would it be the clause limiting interest on Jewish loans? In other words, there is a totemization of Magna Carta that is very significant, and that's part of its history. It's the mythologizing of Magna Carta. Thank you. Now, I probably frightened off anyone else from asking a question. I could sing.
My name's Dick Fluke. I'm an emeritus professor of biology. I don't know which version of the Magna Carta I read, but my question has to do with this statement. It's number 34 in the version I read. No one is to be taken or imprisoned on the appeal of a woman for the death of anyone, save for the death of that woman's husband. Could you explain what that means?
Well, certainly for half of the audience, it doesn't mean anything very good. Again, yes, I didn't bring that up, but yes, women's rights are not really very well protected in Magna Carta. People go on about the rights of widows, which are indeed looked after, and the rights of orphans, including daughters. Those are looked after. But in this particular instance, what seems to have happened is large numbers of women were being incited by men to make appeals for manslaughter and murder against other men. Yeah, go on, accuse them in court, see what happens. And this is an attempt to limit the number of those vexatious cases being brought in court. But that was law in England through to the 19th century. And it's really one extraordinary example of the way in which, in some ways, Magna Carta is very radical. It protects the rights of widows and orphans, and at the same time, it is incredibly conservative. It's that ability to appeal to all shades of political opinion that I think explains part of its magic, part of its appeal even today.
Professor Carol DeVette, Department of Earth and Environment. Fascinating, thank you. Can you comment a little bit about how the Treaty of Arbroath figures into the Magna Carta?
No. I suppose in the sense that Arbroath is seen as an iconic document, a statement of freedom. So the Scots would look back to Arbroath as their moment of breaking away from the government of England. And to that extent, Arbroath is fetishized, is totemized within the Scottish political tradition in the same way that Magna Carta is. And it's interesting, of course, that in both instances, these are documents that are issued by barons, riding on horses, wearing armor. They are both, as it were, statements on behalf of a very tiny political elite that have subsequently been transformed into statements of a far more democratic nature. Can I say something really briefly? That I don't know if there is another question, but if there is, while the questioner is appearing, I mean, that, of course, is very important. This is mythology, and I hope I've shown you there is a lot of mythologizing here. But the myths that we tell about ourselves are terribly significant. If the myths that we tell about ourselves are that we are best at subjugating the rest of the world and making people live in chains and suffering, then we'll behave in one particular way. If our tradition says we are freedom-loving people who just want to do good, then we will behave in another. And we will call politicians to accountability. We will expect a certain degree of behavior on behalf of our politicians that in another system might not be the case.
Chris Bischoff, I'm in history. I was wondering if you could say a few words about the legacy and use of Magna Carta in the Commonwealth and in British colonies.
It certainly was tried by independence fighters in the British colonies to use Magna Carta to suggest that they shouldn't be arrested arbitrarily, that the government, the state should not behave outside the bounds of the law. Didn't work very well. And imperial subjects who appealed to Magna Carta tended to get nowhere. There was a bunch of Sikhs who came into Canada in the early years of the 20th century who appealed to Magna Carta to say that they shouldn't be arrested. That was simply ignored, even in the British High Court. I think you can say the same in America, of course, that this appeal to liberty and freedom did not prevent the fact, and I did point this out in an ABA interview very recently, and that, I suspect, hit the cutting floor pretty much immediately, didn't prevent the fact that it's only 50 years, really, that you've had proper civil liberties in this country. But so the use of Magna Carta by those colonial peoples is really problematic. On the other hand, in the longer term, it gives, after independence, to those Commonwealth countries in Africa, to those other countries like the United States of America that have broken free from British imperialism, it gives them the sense that freedom and liberty are part of their birthright, and that is no bad thing.
Some have argued, my name is Michael Penn, I'm in the psychology department. Some have argued that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights stands on a different philosophical foundation from the Magna Carta. I don't know whether you agree with that, but the argument goes that it is based upon the ontological status of human beings rather than principles that animated the Magna Carta. Could you comment on that?
That is an interesting point. And it's a point that's often argued that the Declaration of Human Rights, for example, argues on the basis of something called natural law, and that natural law arguments were not really employed in the Middle Ages. What we're talking about there is custom and tradition. That, I think, is wrong. There is a lot of natural law in Magna Carta. The idea that justice is something that should not be bought and sold. Now, that would take us all the way back to Roman law. The idea that navigation should be free, that there are things that belong to the people, there are res publica, there are public things. That's a natural law argument that goes back a long, long way beyond this feudal constitution that people believe they're talking about when they talk about Magna Carta. I think it's also very interesting that the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights is as honoured in the breach as in the observance as Magna Carta is. So, as I said, there are a large number of countries that have signed up to the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights who have a very strange definition of what human rights might be. But the argument that really only after Locke does natural law enter the equation, I think is a false one. So philosophically, there is quite a lot in Magna Carta that is based upon principles that go beyond any particular human circumstance.